The world swam back into focus with the scent of something old, like damp stone and a wild, musky perfume I couldn't quite place. I woke in a cage, but this wasn't cold iron that held me. Oh no. This was a cage of shimmering, translucent walls, woven from what looked like spun moonlight and shadows, opulent silks draping a room that screamed wealth and power, yet offered no door, no window, no escape. My head throbbed, a dull echo of the brutal efficiency with which I'd been snatched from my quiet life, from the herb garden where I'd been tending to the moon petal blooms. One moment, the familiar scent of chamomile and earth. The next, a blur of fur, a massive hand clamped over my mouth, and darkness. Now this. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird beating against its confines. What would you have done, waking in the heart of the enemy's den, every instinct screaming of danger, your freedom a forgotten dream? I pushed against the shimmering barrier. It felt like pushing against solidified air, unyielding, humming with a faint, almost silent energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My peaceful community, the elders, my little sister, Alara, a pang of pure terror lanced through me for them. Were they safe? Did they even know what had become of me? They had always warned us about the Lycans, the ancient enemies, their kingdom a place of brutal strength and whispered curses. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to those hushed tales, shouldn't I? And then, he entered. King Theron. The name itself felt like a growl in the heavy air. He didn't walk. He materialized from the deeper shadows of the room, a figure of such overwhelming presence that the very air seemed to crackle and warp around him. He was enormous, a king carved from granite and fury, his eyes the color of molten gold, burning with an intensity that stripped me bare. I'd seen Lycan warriors before during their rare, terrifying raids near our borders, always an omen of conflict. But he was something else entirely, power rolling off him in tangible waves. This was no mere soldier. This was the apex predator, the Lycan King himself. He moved with a predatory grace that was mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure. "You are to be my guest, healer," he stated, his voice a low rumble as cold and unyielding as the ancient mountains that bordered his kingdom. Guest. The word was a mockery, a silken lie draped over the ugly truth of my abduction. "A guarantee," he continued, his gaze pinning me like one of the unfortunate butterflies in my father's collection, "that your people will honor the old treaty, a treaty they have, it seems, forgotten." His words were clipped, precise, each one a tiny shard of ice. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain which treaty, or how my people had supposedly broken it. Because, of course, a king doesn't need to explain himself to a captive. My mind raced. A treaty? Our community were simple healers, guardians of ancient knowledge, not warriors or politicians. What did we have that a Lycan king would want, other than a pawn? As he turned to leave, his golden eyes lingered on me, just for a breath too long, and in their depths I saw not just the cold authority of a king, but something else, something unreadable, a flicker of... what? Curiosity? Or was it the way a wolf eyes its cornered prey? The silence he left behind was more chilling than any threat. Days bled into a featureless expanse of gilded imprisonment. Servants, always Lycans, would appear through the shimmering barrier as if stepping through water, leaving food and taking away the previous meal's remnants. They were silent, their eyes downcast, watchful. Their fear was a palpable thing, a scent almost as strong as the musk of their wolfish nature. It was unnerving, because what could make these powerful, fearsome creatures so afraid? I tried to speak to them, to glean any sliver of information about why I was truly here, about the fate of my village. "Please," I'd whisper, "my people, are they harmed?" But they'd only flinch, their gazes skittering away, offering no word, no comfort, only that pervasive, silent terror. Their silence was a heavier chain than any metal, From the balcony, another shimmering cage, I could see the Lycan city sprawling below, a formidable, almost brutalist landscape of dark stone and imposing towers, all huddled under a sky that seemed permanently bruised. There was a sickness in the air, a subtle wrongness that prickled at my senses, an undercurrent of despair that even the grandeur of the fortress couldn't hide. My own nascent magic, the secret I'd guarded so carefully my entire life, stirred restlessly beneath my skin, like a trapped animal sensing a coming storm. It was a strange, unpredictable thing, this magic of mine, more instinct than control, a legacy from a bloodline I barely understood. The elders had always cautioned against its use, their faces grim. "Some gifts are curses in disguise, Seraphina," they'd murmur. I never understood why. Not until now, perhaps. One afternoon, as I stared out at the bleak city, a commotion in the courtyard below drew my eye. A Lycan warrior, tall and powerfully built even from this distance, suddenly staggered, clutching his arm. Dark, angry veins, like blighted roots, pulsed visibly beneath his skin for a horrifying moment before his comrades rushed to him, half carrying, half dragging him away from prying eyes. The blight, the creeping magical decay I'd only heard whispered about in horrified tones by traders who dared venture near Lycan lands. It was real, and it was here. My breath caught. That night, a young servant, barely more than a boy, fumbled with my dinner tray, his hands shaking. His eyes, wide and terrified, darted towards where I'd been staring at the courtyard hours before. "The king's blight," he whispered, his voice cracking, so low I almost didn't catch it. "It worsens. It touches everyone." Before I could ask more, he bowed hastily and practically fled, leaving me with the chilling confirmation of the kingdom's decay and a new, unsettling question. Was this blight the reason for Theron's desperation? Despite the fear that was a constant cold knot in my belly, I refused to be a completely passive prisoner. What would you do, faced with indefinite captivity? Let your spirit wither? Or fight back in the only ways you could? I chose the latter. During the long, silent hours, I began to subtly test the magical barriers of my cage. Just a little pressure here, a focused thought there. I had to understand their nature, their limits. Even a mouse learns the edges of its trap. I was careful, oh so careful, to hide any outward sign of my abilities. My magic was a secret I'd guarded fiercely in my own community. Here, in the den of my enemies, revealing it felt like baring my throat. All I wanted was freedom, to return to my people, to warn them, to understand the vague, ominous warnings of my elders about Lycans and a shadowed history. "Their power is a devouring flame," Elder Maeve had once told me, her eyes clouded with ancient sorrow, "and ours, child, is the spark they might seek to either rekindle their own or extinguish forever." Her words, cryptic then, now echoed with chilling clarity. One evening, the shimmering wall rippled, and King Theron himself stepped through unannounced. He carried no tray, offered no pretense of hospitality. The silence in the room thickened, became heavy, charged like the air before a lightning strike. He simply stood there, observing me with that unnerving, predatory intensity, as if I were a particularly complex puzzle he was determined to solve. He finally spoke, his voice still that low, dangerous rumble. "Your community, healer. Tell me of its ancient knowledge." His questions were relentless, probing about the old ways, the forgotten lore, the boundaries our ancestors had sworn to protect. I answered guardedly, my fear a cold serpent coiling in my stomach, yet a spark of defiance, small but stubborn, refused to be extinguished. I would not break. I would not be an open book for him to read at his leisure. My bloodline, the very magic he seemed to sense thrumming beneath my skin, was tied to secrets I barely grasped, secrets that now felt like the only shield I possessed. He was like a wolf circling, testing for weakness, and I, a cornered doe, trying desperately to appear anything but vulnerable. He knew something, or suspected it. This wasn't just about a broken treaty, was it? there was more, something deeper, something that made his golden eyes gleam with a dangerous light. As he finally turned to leave, the tension in the room eased almost imperceptibly. But then, he paused at the very edge of the shimmering barrier, his massive silhouette framed against the opulent gloom. His voice, when it came, was a silken threat, a whisper that slid under my skin and chilled me to the bone. Your people guard more than boundaries, healer, and what is guarded can always be taken. He didn't look back. He simply vanished, leaving me alone with his words hanging in the air like a death sentence and a terrifying question burning in my mind. What, exactly, did he believe I could give him? And what would be the price if I couldn't? Or wouldn't?
The weight of this damned crown felt heavier with each passing moon. Each report from the outlying territories a fresh nail hammered into the coffin of my kingdom. My war council chamber, usually a place of strength and strategy, now reeked of stale fear and the cloying metallic scent of the blight's insidious creep. Maps lay scattered across the massive oak table, charting not victories, but the relentless advance of the creeping sickness, a shadow devouring my people, my warriors, my hope. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight filtering through the arrow-slit windows, illuminating the grim faces of my council, Lycans whose powerful shoulders now slumped with a weariness that mirrored my own. How long could we endure? What would you do when everything your ancestors built, everything you swore to protect, crumbles to dust before your very eyes? My gaze swept over them, each hardened warrior, each grizzled elder, their eyes fixed on me, seeking answers I didn't possess. We were Lycans, a race of proud, formidable beings, yet this magical pestilence was reducing us to something frail, something lesser. And the whispers were growing louder, that the curse laid by the healer witch generations ago was finally claiming its due, that perhaps my bloodline was failing. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. The Western patrols report a dozen more afflicted, Your Majesty. Lord Fenris rumbled, his voice hoarse, his usually sharp muzzle now tinged with gray. The sickness spreads faster among the young. They weaken with every cycle of the moon. Faster, always faster. My jaw tightened. I'd taken the healer, Seraphina, from her reclusive community as a desperate gamble, a piece to play in a game I was rapidly losing. Her people, guardians of ancient boundaries and forgotten lore, surely they held some knowledge, some secret to counteract this generations-old affliction, because our own sages and mages had found nothing but dead ends and despair. My hope, a fragile thing, rested on her village, valuing her enough to trade their secrets for her return. Then Lord Valerius spoke, his voice a silken rasp that always set my teeth on edge. He was all sharp angles and colder ambition, a traditionalist who saw the world in black and white, enemy and ally, with no room for the gray shades I was beginning to drown in. Your Majesty, the captive, Seraphina. Perhaps gentler methods are not yielding the swift results we require. Her ancestors, after all, were instrumental in weaving this very curse that strangles our kingdom. It stands to reason she, or her people, know how to unweave it. He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of obsidian. Sometimes, pressure is the only key that turns a stubborn lock. The implication hung heavy in the air. Torture, coercion, methods I abhorred, but the desperation clawing at me was a formidable beast. I slammed my fist on the table, the sound echoing the crack of my fraying control. She is a political prisoner, Valerius, a means to negotiation, not a subject for your experiments, I snarled, my own voice deeper, rougher than intended. My Lycan spirit, always close to the surface, bristled at his callousness. His gaze didn't waver, but a smug, knowing glint entered it. He thought he knew my weaknesses. Truth be told, I wasn't entirely sure he was wrong. I silenced him with a glare that had made lesser Lycans grovel, a glare that promised retribution. Yet, the seed of his ugly suggestion had been planted, a poisonous vine twisting around the already heavy burden of my choices, As the council meeting dragged on, a familiar, sickening tremor ran beneath my skin, a cold fire licking at my veins. The blight. It was stirring within me, a subtle, internal tightening, a faint precursor to the agony I knew could follow. I suppressed the wince, the involuntary clench of my jaw, but not before Valerius's calculating gaze flickered towards me, a predatory stillness in his eyes. He'd noticed. Damn him. The man missed nothing, especially not a hint of weakness in his king. The precariousness of my own strength, my own hold on this kingdom, had never felt so acute. Later, I found myself in the observation chamber, a shadowed alcove overlooking the opulent cage I'd fashioned for the healer. Silk and shadows, yes, but a cage nonetheless. From this vantage, unseen, I watched Seraphina. She was unexpected. Not the cowering, broken thing I might have anticipated. There was a resilience in the set of her small shoulders, a quiet watchfulness in her eyes as she explored her confines, or simply stared out at the blighted city beyond her shimmering walls. Her aura was different, not hostile, not entirely fearful either, but imbued with a strange, almost luminous quality that pricked at my senses. It was unsettling. She was leverage, nothing more. Her reclusive people, steeped in their ancient ways, would surely value a healer of her apparent youth and, dare I admit it, a certain delicate beauty. They would negotiate. They had to, because failure was not an option I could afford. My thoughts, usually a maelstrom of anxieties and grim strategies, found an unexpected, albeit brief, moment of calm when they drifted to her. It was illogical, this fleeting serenity in the face of my kingdom's greatest threat, sparked by the presence of an enemy. Ridiculous. I pulled up the reports from her abduction. Her capture had been swift, efficient. My warriors had reported no true aggression from her, only fear, understandable, and a strange, fierce protectiveness towards some ancient, insignificant relic her village apparently guarded. Just a carved wooden bird, if I recalled. Why such devotion to a trinket? Then, a line in the report, a detail about her lineage previously overlooked, snagged my attention. Descended from the elder healer Maeve of the Whispering Woods. Maeve. The name echoed in the dusty chambers of my memory, a faint chime from forgotten lore, tales my own grandfather, a king who'd seen the blight's first insidious bloom, used to tell. Something about a prophecy, or a pact. The details were lost, like smoke. My hand instinctively went to the old scar on my forearm, a jagged, silvered mark left by a particularly vicious flare-up of the blight years ago. It throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that was my constant companion. But as I pictured Seraphina's face, her defiant eyes, the throbbing lessened. Just for a moment, I dismissed it with a self-directed growl of annoyance, superstition, sentiment, weakness. The blight was addling my mind. The time had come to test her. I summoned Seraphina to a supposedly neutral meeting room, though still deep within the fortress's heart. No silk and shadows here, just cold stone and a heavy table between us. I intended to intimidate, to gauge the depth of her knowledge, to see if Valerius's dark insinuations about her ancestors held any water. I watched her enter, flanked by two of my largest guards. She was small, delicate even, yet she walked with a straightness to her spine that belied her fear, and she was afraid. I could smell it on her, a faint, wild herb scent mixed with the sharp tang of adrenaline. Good. Fear could be a useful tool. Healer, I began, my voice carefully devoid of warmth. We have much to discuss. Treaties. Betrayals. The suffering of my people. I laid out the supposed transgressions of her village, the ancient pacts ignored, the boundaries encroached upon, accusations designed to unsettle, to provoke a reaction. I saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands clenched at her sides, but beneath it, there was that flicker again, that stubborn ember of strength I'd observed before. This was our first true interaction, A meeting under the starkest duress, and she wasn't crumbling. She was listening, intensely. When I spoke of the blight, of the agony it inflicted, of the way it was stealing the life from my kingdom, from Lycan pups who would never know their full strength, from elders who deserved a peaceful twilight, I saw something shift in her expression. For a fleeting second, before she could mask it behind a carefully neutral facade, I saw genuine empathy in her eyes, a profound, unguarded sorrow. It was a flicker, nothing more, but it struck me with the force of a physical blow. That look, it didn't belong on the face of a sworn enemy, a descendant of those who supposedly cursed my kind. It unnerved me more than any defiance. It was human. And it was a hook, pulling me towards an understanding I wasn't sure I wanted. Because if she wasn't the monster of our histories, then what was she? And what did that make me? My need for answers, for a cure, warred with this unsettling, unwelcome feeling she evoked. I dismissed her, the word curt, a shield against the confusion she'd stirred. As she turned to leave, her small figure seemingly dwarfed by the massive guards, the words escaped me, almost against my will, a raw, unplanned question torn from the depths of my desperation. "Healer," I called out, my voice rougher than I intended. "Have your people never sought a cure for curses they themselves laid?" The air thickened, her steps faltered. Slowly she turned back, and the moment her eyes locked with mine, something inside me shifted, a tectonic plate groaning under immense pressure. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, flashed with a surprising fire, no longer just fearful or empathetic, but something sharper, something knowing. "Perhaps some curses, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and steady though quiet, "are shared." And with that she was gone, leaving her words to hang in the oppressive silence of the stone room, a challenge, a riddle, and a terrifying sliver of something that might, just might, be hope. Or perhaps it was simply the beginning of a far more complicated trap.
"Perhaps some curses, Your Majesty, are shared." His name hung in the air, thick and heavy as a storm cloud, even after he'd gone. King Theron's parting shot, that barbed, almost desperate question about curses laid and cures unsought, had burrowed under my skin like a parasitic worm. Shared? What could he possibly mean? My people were healers, not curse weavers. Weren't we? Yet his words, spoken with such raw intensity, echoed the unease that had been a constant companion since I'd learned of the king's blight. It was a terrifying thought that our histories might be more entangled, more shadowed, than I'd ever been taught. That night, and for many nights that followed, I found a desperate sort of courage born from his unsettling query. Sleep was a distant shore I couldn't reach, so instead, I delved into the forbidden territory of my own nascent magic. What else could I do, with his words haunting me, but seek answers in the one place left to me, my own hidden power? My communication with Theron, if you could call it that, was minimal. Terse summons to another silent, watchful meal, or a brief, unnerving appearance where he'd simply stare, his golden eyes probing as if trying to peel back the layers of my soul. It made my skin crawl, yet deep down, a traitorous part of me recognized the desperation in his gaze. He was a king watching his kingdom die. So, in the dead of night, when the fortress was a slumbering beast and the only sounds were the distant howl of a lone Lycan or the rhythmic tread of guards in far-off corridors, I would sit on the cold stone floor of my opulent prison and reach. I'd close my eyes, shutting out the silk and shadows, and turn inwards, seeking that fragile, flickering spark I'd always been taught to suppress. It was like fumbling in the dark for a switch, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. My magic, it seemed, was an unruly thing, more instinct than discipline, responding to the ambient magical energy of the fortress itself. And that energy, oh, it was tainted, thick with the cloying scent of the blight, a palpable sickness that clung to everything like a shroud. Yet, as I tentatively prodded it, coaxed it, My own magic seemed to resonate, to find a strange, discordant harmony with the fortress's blighted heart. It was like touching a live wire. Frightening. Powerful. One night, after countless attempts, a breakthrough. My fingers, outstretched, trembled as a small, pale globe of light coalesced between them, a tiny, defiant ward against the oppressive darkness. It pulsed with a gentle warmth, a creation purely of my will. And then, something utterly unexpected happened. As the ward solidified, I felt it. A distant, almost imperceptible throb of sympathetic magic from somewhere deep within the castle's stone heart, as if something ancient and powerful had sighed in recognition. A connection. My breath hitched. Before I could analyze it, before I could even truly process what it meant, the soft scuff of a boot sounded just outside my shimmering barrier. My heart leaped into my throat, and I snuffed out the ward in a panic, plunging the room back into its usual gloom. A guard, his silhouette a dark shape against the faint corridor light, paused by my chamber. I held my breath, certain he'd sensed something, certain he'd raised the alarm. He seemed to hesitate, his head cocked as if listening to a sound just beyond his hearing, a flicker of confusion on his unseen face. Then, with a shrug that I felt more than saw, he moved on. My relief was so profound it left me shaking. But the memory of that resonant throb, that fleeting connection to something vast and ancient within these cursed walls lingered. What was my magic, really? And how could it possibly be linked to this blighted kingdom? A few days later, in a gesture that surprised me, Theron grudgingly allowed me access to the fortress library. Under supervision, of course, he'd rumbled, his tone suggesting he expected me to try and pilfer state secrets from between the pages of dusty tomes. The library was a cavernous space, smelling of ancient parchment, beeswax, and something indefinably lichen, a faint, musky wildness. It was a treasure trove, but a dangerous one, because every book might hold damnation or salvation. My guard, a hulking lichen named Kale who seemed more interested in sharpening his claws on the leg of a table than in my perusal of history, mostly left me to it. I wasn't looking for state secrets. I was looking for answers, anything on curses, on ancient treaties between lichens and healers, anything that might explain Theron's cryptic words or the unsettling resonance I'd felt. And then I found it. Tucked away in a shadowed alcove, bound in faded, cracked leather with no title on its spine, was a text that felt forbidden. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the script spoke of a time before the Great Enmity, a time when lichen strength and healer magic were not at odds but intertwined. It detailed the origins of the lichen-healer conflict, not as a simple tale of lichen aggression and healer retribution, as our village lore proclaimed, but as a catastrophic magical imbalance, a schism born from shared ambition and a ritual gone horribly wrong. My fingers trembled as I traced the spidery script. This changed everything. This wasn't just their curse. It was our shared history of failure. Finding anything of interest, healer? Theron's voice, that deep, familiar rumble, cut through the library's silence, making me jump so violently the ancient book nearly slipped from my grasp. He stood at the end of the towering bookshelf, materializing as silently as ever, his golden eyes fixed on the forbidden text in my hands. I braced for fury, for accusations of prying where I shouldn't. Instead, there was a tense, almost hungry curiosity in his gaze. This was it, wasn't it? The first moment of something almost genuine between us, a hostile curiosity perhaps, but a connection forged over the shared, painful weight of our intertwined histories. He didn't punish me. He didn't confiscate the book. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as I slowly, deliberately, continued to read. My heart hammered, a wild bird in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, the truth I was uncovering could lead to my freedom, or at least to understanding. He moved closer, his presence a palpable force, and pointed a single, massive, claw-tipped finger to a passage near the bottom of the page. His touch, even so close, sent an unwanted shiver down my spine. "Only when the two bloodlines unite in purpose," he read aloud, his voice a low growl, "can the balance be restored and the shadow lifted." He then let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound devoid of any real humor. Fairy tales for frightened pups. But as he turned away, his eyes, for the briefest of moments, betrayed a flicker of something that looked terrifyingly like desperate, drowning hope. And I wondered, what if this fairy tale was the only truth that could save us all? The days that followed were filled with a strange new tension. The air between me and Theron crackled with unspoken things, with the weight of that forbidden text and the impossible hope it hinted at. He allowed me more exercise, supervised, of course, in the castle's desolate, wind-swept gardens. It was during one such outing that I saw it, a young Lycan pup, no bigger than a large dog from my village, huddled near a blighted rosebush. Its fur, which should have been a glossy brown, was patchy and dull, and its small body trembled with a feverish intensity. Early signs of the blight. My healer's instincts, deeply ingrained, long suppressed in this hostile land, surged to the forefront, overriding my fear, overriding my caution. What would you have done, seeing such innocent suffering? I looked around. Kyle, my ever-present shadow, was momentarily distracted, his attention caught by a hawk circling overhead. This was my chance. Moving with a subtlety I didn't know I possessed, I knelt by the pup, murmuring soft, soothing words. It flinched at my approach, its small, golden eyes wide with pain and fear. Carefully, shielding my actions with my body, I reached out, not with my hand, but with that nascent magic, that flickering inner light. I didn't try to cure it. I wouldn't know how, and the risk of exposure was too great. Instead, I focused on easing its pain, on soothing the fever, on offering a tiny bubble of comfort in its suffering. A soft, golden glow, almost invisible in the gray afternoon light, enveloped my hand for a mere second. The pup's trembling eased. It let out a soft sigh, its small body relaxing slightly against the cold earth. It even managed a weak lick of my fingers, before I quickly withdrew. From a distance, half hidden by the gnarled trunk of an ancient, blighted oak, King Theron watched. I hadn't known he was there. His face was a mask, his expression utterly unreadable, those molten gold eyes fixed on me and the now sleeping pup. He saw the pup's relief. He must have seen my clandestine action, or at least suspected. Yet he didn't intervene. He didn't roar in anger. He didn't punish me. He simply watched, a silent, brooding statue, until Kale finally noticed me by the rose bush and gruffly motioned for me to return. The weight of the king's gaze followed me all the way back to my gilded cage. Later that evening, I was summoned. Not to the dining chamber, not to the library, but to his private study, a room I'd never seen, filled with maps, weapons, and the heavy scent of his power. He looked conflicted. More than conflicted. He looked like a man torn in two. "The pup you aided in the garden today," he began, his voice a low, strained rumble, his eyes searching mine, not with accusation, but with an almost unbearable intensity. "It is faring better. Better than any other afflicted youngling we have seen in months." He took a step closer, the space between us shrinking, charged with a dangerous energy. "How?" The question was a demand, a plea, a whisper of dread and a desperate, burning desire for an answer he seemed to already know, and fear. My world tilted. How could I not see it before? My magic, the blight, his desperation. It was all connected, wasn't it? And in that moment, I knew my captivity had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous.
How? The word hung in the stale air of my study, a raw, desperate sound torn from my throat. How had she done it? The pup, one of many fading under the blight's relentless touch, was not just stable, but improving. My best healers, my most learned sages, had achieved nothing close. Yet Seraphina, this slip of a girl, this descendant of my enemies, had merely touched it, and life had rallied. Her explanation, when it came, was guarded, full of half-truths about soothing fevers and calming spirits, but her eyes, those stormy sea-green eyes, held a depth of power she was trying desperately to conceal. Looking back, I should have known then that she was more than just a healer. She was a key, a terrifying, dangerous, and perhaps essential key. But what lock did she fit? And did I dare to turn it? The thought was a precipice, and I, a king on the verge of plunging into an abyss of the unknown. My kingdom was dying, and if she held the answer, could I afford not to use her, regardless of the cost to my pride, to my history, to her? The pressure from my council, particularly from that sanctimonious vulture, Lord Valerius, was becoming unbearable. In the dim, oppressive confines of the War Council chamber, his voice was a constant, insidious drip, eroding my resolve. Your Majesty, the healer possesses abilities, this much is clear, Valerius pressed, his sharp features taut with a predatory zeal. She aided the pup. Imagine what she could do if properly motivated. The blight does not wait for polite negotiation. His cronies, a pack of hardline traditionalists who saw betrayal in every shadow and weakness in every moment of consideration, echoed his sentiments. They spoke of forced cooperation, of magical coercion, even of ritualistic methods to extract whatever knowledge or power she held. They saw her as a tool, a resource to be exploited, nothing more. Each word was a brand against my conscience because, truth be told, a dark, desperate part of me, the part that watched my people wither and weaken daily, was tempted by their brutal pragmatism. Yet, when I pictured Seraphina, her quiet defiance, that flicker of genuine empathy I'd seen, the way she'd instinctively shielded that blighted pup, I couldn't reconcile that image with the monstrous witch of Valerius's imaginings. I resisted them, my voice a low growl of warning that still held power, for now. She will be treated as a valuable asset, not as fodder for your desperate experiments, Valerius, I'd countered, the words feeling hollow even to my own ears. How long could I hold them off? How long before their fear, and my own, consumed us all? Then Valerius played his trump card. He'd been busy, the sly wolf. Through my own, diligent research, Your Majesty, he announced, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on his thin lips. I have confirmed the healer Seraphina's direct lineage. She is, it appears, a true descendant of the healer Maeve, the very sorceress whose magic is said to have laid the most potent and enduring aspects of the blight upon our ancestors. The chamber fell silent. The air crackled. So, not just any healer, a direct descendant of the architect of our misery. Valerius leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. This changes things, wouldn't you agree? It makes her uniquely dangerous, perhaps. Or, Your Majesty. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that slithered through the room. Uniquely valuable as a sacrifice. Perhaps her blood is the key, Your Majesty. One way, or another. His words were a chilling pronouncement, a death sentence veiled as a solution, and the way the other hardliners looked at me, I knew they were considering it. The thought of spilling her blood, even if she was the devil incarnate, churned my stomach. But what if he was right? That night, the blight, as if summoned by the council's dark intentions, attacked me with a ferocity I hadn't experienced in years. It began as a familiar chill, then escalated into a searing inferno that clawed its way through my veins, my muscles, my very bones. I retreated to my private chambers, dismissing my guards, needing to battle this alone. The pain was a living entity, coiling around my spirit, threatening to shatter my control, to unleash the primal beast within me in a torrent of uncontrolled rage and agony. My Lycan form pushed against my human skin, a desperate, snarling thing seeking release. I bit back a howl, knuckles white as I gripped the stone windowsill, staring out at the blighted moon. The kingdom was crumbling, and so was its king. Without warning, the shimmering barrier to my chambers rippled, and Seraphina stood there. How had she bypassed my guards? Or had she simply sensed it? Her eyes widened, first with fear at my contorted state, the visible tremor shaking my frame, the dark veins pulsing at my temples. She saw me not as a king, but as a creature in torment. And then, something shifted in her gaze. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger, something intrinsic to her healer's nature pushed through it. She moved closer, her steps hesitant but driven. "Your Majesty, Theron," she whispered, her voice trembling, yet carrying a strange note of authority. Before I could snarl a warning, before I could order her away from my monstrous vulnerability, she reached out, her small, cool hands, surprisingly steady, pressed against my burning forehead. And then, magic. Not the dark, insidious magic of the blight, but something else. Something clean. It flowed from her like cool water over scorched earth, a gentle, soothing tide that didn't cure, not fully, but it calmed. It pushed back the raging inferno in my blood, smoothed the jagged edges of my agony, brought a breathtaking moment of clarity to the pain-fueled chaos in my mind. It was a raw, terrifying moment of vulnerability for me. To be seen like this, to be touched, to be soothed by her, the enemy. And for her, I could only imagine the terror of wielding her power so openly, so close to the very beast whose ancestors warred with hers. As the blight receded, not banished, but leashed, our eyes locked. The air crackled, thick with unspoken things, with the raw intensity of shared pain and unexpected solace. The connection was a physical shock, leaving us both breathless, profoundly shaken. What in the name of all the ancient gods was happening between us? The encounter left me reeling, my mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Valerius's insidious words, the terrifying power of the blight, and now this inexplicable, unwanted connection to the healer. My authority, my control, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I had to reassert dominance, to understand what she was, what she could do, and how I could use it, for my kingdom, of course. Only for my kingdom. I summoned her again, this time to the cold, impersonal meeting room. No more accidental intimacies. This would be a confrontation. "Your power, healer," I began, my voice harsher than I intended, a shield against the turmoil she evoked. "You will tell me its nature, you will help my people. Cooperate, and you will be rewarded beyond measure. Your village will be showered with riches, with protection." I offered her the gilded cage, a larger, more comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless. When her only response was a guarded silence, her chin tilted in that infuriatingly defiant way, the desperation and fear clawed their way out as a threat. "Refuse, and understand that my patience and that of my council is not limitless. There are other methods." Her expression, which had been carefully neutral, flickered. For a moment I thought I saw fear, but then it was replaced by something else, something akin to disappointment. And then a spark of that fire I was beginning to recognize. "Rewards? Threats?" she said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "Is that all you understand, Your Majesty? Do you truly believe I am a mere tool to be bought or broken?" She took a step closer, her small form radiating an unexpected strength. "The ancient texts I found, the ones you dismissed as fairy tales, they speak of a shared problem, a shared curse. Not my sole responsibility to fix your kingdom's woes." She looked directly into my eyes, her gaze unwavering, and the air thickened, the space between us burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with some terrible, undeniable truth. "Looking back, Your Majesty," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming almost intimately soft. Yet every word was a hammer blow against the walls I'd built around myself. The moments your power calmed near me, the way my presence soothed the pup, even this blight within you that recoiled from my touch, it should have screamed the truth to both of us. This binds us, deeper than captor and captive, deeper than king and pawn. Before I could process her words, before I could even begin to understand the cataclysmic shift she was suggesting, the doors to the meeting room burst open. Valerius stood there, flanked by a dozen of his most loyal guards, their faces grim, their hands on their weapons. His eyes, cold and triumphant, met mine. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a silken apology that held no actual regret. "Forgive my intrusion, but the council has deliberated. We have decided. The healer's unique properties must be tested thoroughly. For the good of the kingdom, of course." He didn't even glance at Seraphina. His gaze was fixed on me, a challenge, an ultimatum. My eyes flicked from Valerius's cold, unyielding resolve to Seraphina's face, where defiance warred with a very real, very understandable fear. My kingdom, my enemy, my... What? My mind reeled. Everything was unraveling, and I was trapped in the center of the storm.
My world narrowed to the cold, impassive faces of Lord Valerius's guards as they dragged me from King Theron's study. Theron. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word to stop them. Though his face was a mask of such contained fury, I thought the very stones of the fortress might crack. A bitter taste of betrayal filled my mouth. He'd let them take me. After everything, after that moment of shared vulnerability when my magic had soothed his blight-ridden agony, after my near confession about the bond I felt growing between us, he'd simply stood aside. Deep down, a tiny, grudging part of me, the part that had seen the political wolves circling him in his own council, understood the impossible position he was in. But understanding didn't lessen the sting, nor did it quell the icy dread coiling in my stomach. What tests did Valerius, with his cold, calculating eyes, have in mind? I soon found out. My new prison was a far cry from the opulent cage of silk and shadows. This was a true dungeon cell, damp, cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and despair. The magic that had hummed in my previous prison, the magic I had begun to understand, to tentatively wield, was absent here. Instead, the very walls seemed to leach warmth and hope, designed, I suspected, to dampen not just spirits, but magical abilities as well. Valerius didn't keep me waiting long. He appeared like a wraith in the gloom, his smile thin and chilling. "Do not fret, healer," he purred, his voice devoid of any actual comfort. "Your discomfort will be temporary." He then explained, with a horrifyingly detached politeness, their theory. My blood, my life force, perhaps even my very soul, might be the key. Not to a cure necessarily, but to a ritual. A ritual to stall the blight, to buy them time. Or, if I proved particularly potent, perhaps a full sacrifice could break the curse entirely. Can you imagine the chill? Knowing your life might be a mere ingredient in some dark, desperate recipe? He held up a dagger then, its obsidian blade gleaming with a malevolent light in the dim torch glow. It was clearly ancient, carved with unsettling symbols that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, healer," Valerius repeated, his eyes glittering with an almost religious fervor. "Your sacrifice will be remembered. Generations of Lycans will sing your name, the little healer who saved our mighty race." His words were meant to be a grand pronouncement, but all I heard was my own death knell. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sacrifice. The word echoed the darkest warnings of my elders. "They will see your light, child," Elder Maeve had once whispered, her eyes like faded tapestries, "and some will seek to nurture it, while others will only wish to snuff it out, fearing what they do not understand or coveting its power for themselves." Looking back, her words were a prophecy I hadn't comprehended until Valerius stood before me, his face alight with fanaticism. My fear was a living thing, cold and sharp, Yet a stubborn spark of defiance still flickered within me. I would not be a willing lamb to his slaughter. The next day, under heavy guard, I was dragged from my cell and forced into the deepest, most forbidden section of the fortress archives, a place where even the dust seemed to breathe secrets and shadows clung like ancient cobwebs. Valerius, it seemed, needed my unique insight as a healer, or perhaps just my presence as a descendant of Maeve to help him locate the precise ritual he intended to perform. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment and forgotten magic. Hour after agonizing hour, I was forced to sift through brittle scrolls and ponderous, iron-bound tomes, each one filled with arcane symbols and unsettling diagrams. My guards watched my every move, their faces impassive, but their predatory stillness was a constant reminder of my precarious situation. And then, I found it. Not the gruesome ritual Valerius sought, but something far more significant. Something that felt like destiny itself reaching out a spectral hand. Tucked inside the binding of the very treaty Theron had accused my people of breaking, the one that had supposedly led to my abduction, was a hidden compartment. My fingers, trembling with a mixture of dread and a sudden, inexplicable hope, pried it open. Inside lay a single sheet of parchment, far older, far more delicate than the treaty itself. It felt almost alive beneath my touch, humming with a faint residual magic. The script was archaic, a variant of the healer tongue I'd only seen in our most sacred, hidden texts. As I deciphered the faded words, the world tilted on its axis. My breath caught in my throat. The revelation was a lightning strike, illuminating the shadowed history of our peoples with a terrifying, brilliant clarity. The curse, it wasn't just laid by healers upon Lycans in an act of vengeful defense. No, it was a catastrophic magical backlash, a devastating consequence of a joint ritual attempted by both our ancestors, Lycan Kings and lead healers, side by side, a desperate, arrogant bid to seize immense, godlike power. And it had gone horribly, apocalyptically wrong, twisting their combined magic into the very blight that now plagued the Lycans, and perhaps the reason my own people's magic had dwindled to whispers and warnings. But there was more. The parchment spoke of a path to undo the damage, a single terrifying hope. Not sacrifice, not retribution. Only a willing union, I read, the words searing themselves into my mind. A union of heart, of magic, and of blood, between true descendants of the original Lycan King and the lead healer who forged that disastrous pact, can fully break the chains of the past and restore the balance. A willing union. My mind raced. Theron, King Theron, he was undoubtedly the descendant of that Lycan King. And I, Seraphina, whose lineage traced directly back to Maeve, the lead healer of those ancient tales. I was the other. We were, by some cruel, impossible twist of fate, the ultimate forbidden mates, our union the only salvation for his people, and perhaps for the fading magic of mine. A willing union, I gasped aloud, the parchment trembling in my hand. It was never about one-sided blame, it was shared. Before the words fully left my lips, Valerius was there. He snatched the parchment from my grasp, his eyes, those sharp obsidian chips, widening first in disbelief, then narrowing with a terrifying, predatory cunning as he scanned the ancient script. He might not read the healer tongue fluently, but the symbols, the context alongside the treaty he already knew, he understood enough. Before Valerius could fully process the implications of this earth-shattering revelation, before his cunning mind could twist this new knowledge to his own dark purposes, chaos erupted. Shouts echoed from the corridor outside the archives, the clang of steel on steel, and then the unmistakable, earth-shaking roar of a Lycan King in full battle fury. Theron. My heart leaped. He hadn't abandoned me, or perhaps he was merely reclaiming his asset. His guards, Valerius's guards. It was hard to tell who was fighting whom in the sudden, brutal skirmish that spilled into the archives. Theron was a whirlwind of controlled destruction, moving with a speed and power that was breathtakingly terrifying. And yet, in that moment, undeniably beautiful. He wasn't just fighting, he was orchestrating, his every move designed to clear a path, to create an opening to me. Moments later, he was there, pulling me from Valerius's stunned grasp, his eyes blazing with 1,000 emotions I couldn't decipher. "What did you find?" he growled, his voice raw, urgent, his grip on my arm like iron, yet somehow not crushing. Valerius looked like he'd seen a ghost, or a gold mine, and knowing him, they're often one and the same. Wordlessly, my hands shaking, I pressed the ancient parchment, the addendum to the treaty, into his. The weight of generations, of shared doom, and now, this terrifying shared hope, settled between us, as tangible as the stone walls of the fortress. He stared at the parchment, then at me, a maelstrom raging in those golden eyes. Disbelief, horror, a dawning, terrible understanding, and something else, something that looked so treacherously like desire it stole the breath from my lungs. "A willing union," he repeated, his voice hoarse, rough with an emotion I couldn't name. He looked up from the ancient script, his gaze locking with mine, and it felt like the whole world, all our history, all our future, hung suspended in that single, shattering moment. "Our ancestors," he breathed, the words a death knell and a prayer. "They tried to play gods and doomed us all to this." And just like that, as if summoned by the weight of his words, alarms blared throughout the fortress. Loud, strident, urgent. Valerius, recovering his composure, a snarl twisting his lips, had triggered a lockdown. We were trapped. Together. And the only way out, it seemed, was through a destiny neither of us had ever asked for.
A willing union. The words on that damned ancient parchment seared themselves onto my soul, a brand of impossible fate. My ancestors, fools and power-hungry tyrants, had tried to play gods, and instead unleashed this eternal night upon us. And Seraphina, this healer, this descendant of their chief accomplice in that catastrophic failure, was now supposedly the key to our salvation? The alarms blared, a screeching symphony of betrayal orchestrated by Valerius, and just like that, the weight of generations, the crushing despair of the blight, the impossible hope offered by that fragile piece of script, all coalesced into a single, stark reality. We were trapped, hunted, and she was the only thing that mattered. My hand tightened on her arm, not in anger but in a desperate, possessive instinct. "We move," I snarled, the king in me momentarily overshadowed by the primal Lycan fighting for survival. For her. What would you have done, faced with the ruin of your kingdom and the one insane chance to save it clutched in your hand, with wolves you once called brothers baying at your heels? We plunged into the hidden passages of the fortress, a labyrinth I knew like the back of my own hand, yet now it felt like a tightening noose. The lockdown was brutally effective. Every main route was sealed, patrolled by Valerius's loyalists. And truth be told, how many of my own guards would still stand with a king accused of treason, of being bewitched by an enemy healer? Valerius was thorough. I'd give him that. He'd be painting me as a lovesick fool, a traitor to my bloodline, a king who'd forsaken his people for an ancient enemy. And perhaps in their fear-addled minds they'd believe him. Why wouldn't they? I barely believed the truth myself. The stress, the running, the cloying scent of old stone and fear. It stoked the blight within me. It gnawed, a restless fire licking at the edges of my control, making my senses too sharp, my temper too volatile. Seraphina stayed close, her small presence a strange anchor in the chaos, her eyes wide but her jaw set with a determination that mirrored my own growing desperation. We were cornered eventually in a forgotten junction of tunnels, the air thick with the promise of violence. Valerius stood before us, no longer the silken courtier, but a warlord tasting victory, flanked by a dozen of his most hardened warriors. He had the audacity to look almost regretful. "Theron," he began, the use of my given name a deliberate insult, a stripping of my crown. It doesn't have to end like this. Surrender the healer. She will serve her purpose one way or another. The ritual demands a descendant of Maeve. Think of it, her single life for the salvation of our entire race. He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes like chips of ice. Do this and you may yet retain your life, perhaps even a semblance of your crown, though of course, under new advisement. A puppet king. That's what he offered. My life. For my kingdom's soul, and for her. Then Seraphina, bless her brave, foolish heart, spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the sudden, tense silence. He's right, Theron, she said, looking up at me, and in her eyes I saw not surrender but a terrible, heartbreaking understanding. One life. For many. It's the logical choice. She was offering herself, to save me, to save them, after everything. Something inside me snapped. A harsh, broken sound ripped from my throat, a laugh raw and edged with madness. Fools, I roared, the sound bouncing off the oppressive stone walls, the blight within me surging not with sickness, but with a white-hot, clarifying rage. You think sacrificing her will save you? You witless, power-hungry curs? I turned on Valerius, my eyes blazing with a power that had lain dormant too long, a newfound clarity cutting through the fog of despair and generations of ingrained hatred. This isn't about one life for many. This is about ending a cursed cycle our ancestors, in their blind arrogance, began. She is not a sacrifice to be offered up on the altar of your fear. My gaze found Seraphina's and the words tore from me, brutal and honest, a confession I hadn't known I possessed until that very moment. She is our salvation, you blind fools. Then, softer, my voice raw with an emotion that felt dangerously like something sacred, something I had no right to feel, and curse my blood, healer. The words were a vow, a claim, an undeniable truth that resonated through every fiber of my being. It seems she is also mine. Before Valerius or his men could react, before the shock could even register on their faces, I let go. The beast within, the true power of the Lycan King, erupted not in uncontrolled, blighted rage, but with a focused, terrible purpose. My bones reshaped, fur sprouted, claws extended. I became the predator, the protector. Between one heartbeat and the next, I was a shield of fur and fury before Seraphina, my roar a promise of death to any who dared touch her. I launched myself at Valerius's guards, a whirlwind of black fur and flashing claws, a king fighting not just for his kingdom, but for its only future. The battle that followed was a blur of desperate ferocity. We were driven back through the labyrinthine corridors towards the fortress's main ritual chamber, the very place Valerius had intended for Seraphina's sacrifice. How fitting. He wanted a stage for his power play, and I, it seemed, was determined to give him a performance he'd never forget. I fought with the strength of 10 Lycans, fueled by a righteous fury and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge of what truly lay at stake. And Seraphina, she was magnificent. No longer a cowering captive, she moved with a desperate grace, her nascent magic flaring around her, not as offensive blasts, but as shields, as diversions, as subtle weavings of energy that deflected blows meant for me, that momentarily blinded my attackers, that seemed to anticipate my every move. Our actions, unplanned, uncoordinated, somehow found a rhythm, a deadly dance of survival. But Valerius was no fool. Empowered by his desperate hardliners and I suspected by some dark, blighted artifacts he'd unearthed from the fortress's shadowed vaults, he proved a formidable opponent. He met my fury with a cold, calculated viciousness. Then, pain. Searing, unholy pain. Valerius, wielding a blade that pulsed with a sickly green luminescence, a cursed weapon, no doubt, slipped past my guard, the blade bit deep into my side. It wasn't just the physical wound that stole my strength, it was the magic clinging to it, a vile, corrosive energy that attacked my Lycan spirit. that amplified the blight already raging within me. I stumbled, a roar of agony tearing from my throat as my vision grayed. My strength, my fury, it was all draining away into the cold stone floor. As I fell to my knees, weakened, gasping, Valerius seized his chance. He lunged for Seraphina, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He dragged her struggling towards the central altar, the ritualistic dagger, the one he'd shown her in the dungeons, now appearing in his hand as if by dark magic. It seemed all was lost. My vision tunneled. I could only see her, her face pale with terror, her eyes locked on mine. She screamed my name, a sound that ripped through the fog of my agony, a sound that was both an anchor and a torment. Theron! He raised the dagger, its tip aimed at her heart. Our eyes met across the blood-soaked chamber, a silent, desperate exchange of despair, of apology, of an unspoken emotion that tore at my very soul. Seraphina! I roared, the sound a shredded, desperate mix of agony and a promise I didn't know how I could keep. Just as the dagger began its descent, just as the last vestiges of my hope threatened to extinguish, the blight marking on my arm, the old scar from my near-fatal encounter years ago, pulsed. Violently. Not with the familiar cold fire of sickness, but with an explosive, uncontrollable surge of raw, golden power that erupted outwards, blasting through the chamber like a miniature sun.
The world exploded in a wave of raw golden power, a concussive force that slammed me back against the cold stone of the ritual chamber, stealing the air from my lungs. Valerius and his men were thrown like rag dolls, their triumphant cries cut short by a sound that was pure, untamed energy. For a heart-stopping moment, silence reigned, thick and ringing, punctuated only by the groan of stressed stone. My vision cleared, spots dancing before my eyes. Theron. He was still on his knees, but the agonizing tension that had contorted his features was replaced by a stunned, almost awed expression. His blight-marked arm glowing with that same ferocious golden light. It wasn't the sickly, parasitic glow of the curse. This was something vital, something pure. But the cursed wound in his side, inflicted by Valerius's dark blade, still wept crimson, a stark contrast to the incandescent power radiating from him. He was a paradox of imminent death and impossible vitality. And in that instant, I understood. That surge, that impossible blast of energy, it wasn't just the blight flaring, it was his life force, his very Lycan spirit, roaring in defiance, amplified perhaps by the desperate, undeniable bond that had been forged between us in fire and fear. He had truly chosen me, chosen hope, over the centuries of ingrained hatred, over the logical sacrifice his counsel demanded. He'd chosen us. Looking back, I should have realized the depth of that choice sooner. It was written in every desperate glance, every conflicted word. What would you have done, seeing the one who held your life in his hands offer his own instead? My fear, that cold, familiar serpent, didn't vanish, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, surging protectiveness, by a clarity so profound it felt like a divine revelation. I scrambled to his side, my knees scraping against the rough-hewn floor, heedless of the chaos, of the groaning figures of Valerius's men beginning to stir. His golden eyes, still dazed, found mine, and in their depths, I saw not a king, not a captor, but a soul laid bare, pained but resolute. This was my choice now. No more hiding. No more fear of what my magic was, or what it could do. A willing union, Theron, I whispered, the words of the ancient prophecy a sacred vow on my lips. My hands, no longer trembling with fear but steady with purpose, covered his grievous wound. I closed my eyes, not in prayer, but in absolute focus, and I reached. I channeled every ounce of my burgeoning power, every hidden spark, every drop of the healer's legacy that flowed through my veins, not just as a healer mending flesh, but as his fated counterpart, the other half of a broken whole, offering not just solace, but union. Can you feel it? That moment when all your fear falls away, replaced by a certainty so profound it sings in your very blood? Our combined energies flared, a blinding incandescent nova of his primal Lycan power, wild, untamed, golden, and my bright, clear healing magic, serene, focused, silver. They didn't just touch, they intertwined, they embraced, they became one, creating a light so intense, so pure, it felt as if the sun itself had descended into that blighted ritual chamber. The moment our powers truly merged, the ancient carved markings on the chamber floor, the very symbols that detailed the rituals of the curse, blazed with an answering light, the ink of the prophecy Theron still clutched in his fist, glowing as if freshly written. It was a symphony of magic, a rebalancing of cosmic scales, the oppressive, sickly atmosphere that had clung to the fortress, to the entire kingdom, for generations began to lift, to dissipate like mist under a dawning sun. The blight on Theron, those creeping veins of darkness, visibly receded from his skin, not just patched or soothed, but undone, healed from the inside out by the reawakened harmony of our combined lineage. This was more than a mere healing. This was our intense love comeback, not a gentle whisper of romance, but a roaring declaration of reclaimed destiny, a fusion of power and passion that shattered the chains of the past. Valerius, recovering faster than his men, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage, staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated snarl and lunged, one last desperate attack with that cursed dagger, unwilling to accept defeat, to accept the miracle unfolding before him. But Theron, no longer the weakened, dying king, rose to meet him. He radiated a new, balanced power, a calm, undeniable authority that was more terrifying than any bestial rage. With a movement too swift for the eye to follow, he struck Valerius down, not with fury, but with the effortless grace of a true king dispensing justice. The cursed dagger clattered across the stone floor, its dark light extinguished. The remaining hardliners, those who had stood with Valerius, stared, their weapons lowering, their faces a mixture of awe and terror, as they witnessed the undeniable truth of the curse undone, of their king reborn. Theron stood, his form still Lycan but the feral rage replaced by a profound serenity, and turned to me. He offered his hand, no longer the claw of a beast, but the strong, steady hand of a king. A partner. "It seems," he said, his voice a low rumble yet devoid of its earlier harshness, now imbued with a warmth that spread through me like sunlight. "Our ancestors left us quite the mess to clean up, my healer." His eyes, those molten gold orbs, held no trace of the tormented captor. Only respect, a profound warmth, and a deep, unwavering love that made my heart soar. Hours later, dawn was breaking over the Lycan kingdom, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The light felt cleaner, brighter, as if the world itself had exhaled a breath held for centuries. We stood in the throne room, no longer captor and captive, but side by side, before a humbled council and a sea of jubilant, disbelieving citizens. The news had spread like wildfire. The curse was broken. Theron, his voice resonating with a newfound strength and clarity, announced it formally. "Not through sacrifice," he proclaimed, his gaze finding mine, holding it, but through union, through the painful, unvarnished truth of our shared history. And then, before the astonished eyes of his court, before the cheering throngs of his people, he declared me, Seraphina, the healer from a reclusive enemy village, his queen, his partner in the new era that dawned before them. There were still so many unspoken things between us. The trauma of my captivity, the terrifying leap of faith we had both taken, the blood and fear that had paved our path to this moment. Yet, as we looked at each other, a profound understanding flowed between us. A new agreement forged in the crucible of fire, magic, and a love that had defied generations of hatred. It was a silent promise of healing, not just for the land, but for our peoples, for ourselves. As the crowd's joyous roar washed over us, a wave of relief and unadulterated hope, I leaned close to him, my voice a mere whisper against the thunderous applause. "And what of the treaty, Your Majesty?" I asked, a teasing light in my eyes. The one you brought me here to break?" Theron smiled then, a genuine, breathtaking smile that transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, almost boyish and utterly captivating. "I believe, my queen," he murmured, his fingers finding mine, intertwining with a warmth that sealed our unspoken vows. We just wrote a new one. And as our hands clasped, a surge of gentle, shared magic, golden and silver, pulsed outwards, a silent blessing upon our united peoples.
The scent of damp earth and blighted hope had been the perfume of my kingdom for so long, I'd almost forgotten what true life smelled like. Now, months after the curse shattered, after Seraphina had willingly poured her light into my darkness, the air was alive with the aroma of new-tilled soil, blooming moon-petal flowers, her favorite, and the joyous, unrestrained laughter of healthy Lycan pups. It was a miracle I still found myself marveling at each dawn, a miracle with stormy, sea-green eyes and a spirit as resilient as the ancient oaks. Looking back, the idea that I, Theron, the accursed Lycan King, could ever know such peace, such simple, profound contentment, would have been laughable, a cruel joke whispered by the ghosts of my failures. Yet here we were. The kingdom was healing, not just the land, but its people, their spirits mending alongside their blighted bodies. And it was all because of her, my healer, my queen. The days became a tapestry woven with shared purpose and a deepening, quiet intimacy I'd never dared to imagine. I watched her, often. Seraphina, no longer a captive but a radiant force of nature, moved among my people. Her healing magic now an open, celebrated gift. She taught the young Lycan healers, her gentle patience a stark contrast to my own often gruff demeanor. Yet they adored her, their eyes following her with a reverence once reserved only for the eldest sages. We worked together side by side, overseeing the rebuilding efforts, forging new alliances, even with her own reclusive community, who, after witnessing the truth of the curse's undoing, had cautiously extended a hand of fellowship. Her counsel was invaluable, her perspective as a healer, as an outsider who had seen us at our worst, bringing a wisdom that tempered my kingly pragmatism. There were moments, stolen amidst the duties of our rule, that I treasured more than any royal decree. Laughter shared over a simple meal, her hand instinctively finding mine as we walked through the recovering forests. The way her eyes would soften when she looked at me, a look that still, after all this time, made my scarred heart stumble. One afternoon we stood at the ancient boundary, the moss-covered stones that had once symbolized generations of enmity. Now it felt different. Not a barrier, but a meeting place. Together we planted a young sapling, its roots taking hold in earth once deemed cursed. As our hands pressed into the soil, a faint luminescence, gold from my Lycan core, silver from her healer's light, pulsed from the sapling, a silent promise of intertwined destinies. Later that day, an old healer from Seraphina's village, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of ages, and who had initially regarded me with deep suspicion, approached me. She bowed her head, a gesture of profound respect. "You have done well, King Theron," she said, her voice raspy with age but clear with sincerity. "You both have. The balance returns." Her words, a simple acknowledgement from a former enemy, felt like a benediction, a confirmation that the path we'd chosen, the impossible path, was true. The grand hall of the fortress, once a place of grim counsels and shadowed fears, was now ablaze with light and joyous celebration. This wasn't just a political necessity, this coronation, this formalization of our union. It was a true festival of hearts, a testament to the miracle we had wrought together. I stood before my people, before Seraphina's people, no longer the harsh, burdened king whose soul was eaten by a creeping blight, but a Lycan whole, my spirit healed, my heart full. Seraphina stood beside me, radiant, confident, her past fears and the trauma of her captivity replaced by a serene trust and an incandescent joy that lit her from within. As I looked at her, my queen, my savior, my love, the vows I had prepared, words painstakingly chosen to convey the depth of my gratitude, my devotion, my utter adoration, felt wholly inadequate. Yet I spoke them, my voice thick with emotion, recounting our journey from the depths of enmity and despair to this improbable, glorious dawn. I spoke of a future I had once believed impossible, a future now stretching before us, bright with promise, because she was by my side. You are the light that chased away my eternal night, Seraphina, I concluded, my gaze locked with hers, the entire hall fading into insignificance. My heart, my soul, my kingdom, they are yours, now and forever. When she spoke her own vows, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a love that mirrored my own, I knew my transformation was complete. I was no longer just a king. I was hers, and in that, I found a strength greater than any I had ever known. The moment our lips met, sealing our vows, a wave of benevolent magic, gold and silver light intertwined, washed over the cheering crowd, a spontaneous blessing from our united powers, a shared sigh of contentment from the very soul of our renewed land. This was it, our happily ever after, hard-won, fiercely protected, and utterly, breathtakingly real. Later that night, the fortress was quiet. The echoes of celebration faded into a peaceful hum. We stood on the balcony of our private chambers, the same balcony from which Seraphina had once viewed my blighted city as a prisoner. Now, it overlooked a kingdom thriving under the light of a benevolent, watchful moon. No longer captor and captive, no longer king and political pawn. We were partners, king and queen, husband and wife, lovers, friends. I pulled her close, her warmth a familiar comfort against my side, her scent, wild honey and moon petals, an intoxicating balm to my soul. The silence between us was easy, filled with an understanding that transcended words. I never imagined a future like this, I murmured, my voice rough with the depth of my emotion, my gaze sweeping over the peaceful panorama before us. A future where hope wasn't a dying ember but a steady, warming flame. Seraphina leaned her head against my shoulder, her fingers tracing the new, healthy lines of my hand, where once the blight had threatened to consume. Perhaps, she whispered, her voice like the softest music, the best futures, my love, are the ones we never dared to dream. She turned in my arms then, her stormy sea-green eyes shimmering with a love so profound it took my breath away. And as our lips met, a deep, loving kiss that spoke of promises kept, of battles won, of a future stretching bright and boundless before us, I knew a peace that surpassed all understanding. This was more than a fairy tale ending. This was our truth, forged in darkness, redeemed by courage, and sealed by a love that had broken a kingdom's curse and healed a king's blighted heart. And as I held her, my queen, my Seraphina, under the silent, watchful gaze of the moon, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that our story was just beginning.